I have studied strategic competition between great powers for decades, and I can tell you that China is executing one of the most sophisticated takeover strategies in history. What makes it remarkable is not military aggression or territorial conquest. It is the patient construction of dependencies that make confrontation unnecessary. China is winning without fighting, and most people do not realize it is happening because they are looking for the wrong signals. The Western mind, particularly the American mind, thinks about competition in terms of direct confrontation. You build a bigger military, you challenge rivals openly, you win through superior force. This is chess thinking, where the goal is to eliminate the opponent's king through aggressive maneuvers. China thinks differently. China plays Go, an ancient strategy game where victory comes not from destroying the opponent, but from surrounding them, controlling territory gradually and making resistance futile without direct combat. Understanding this strategic difference is essential to understanding why China does not need war to achieve its objectives. War is expensive, unpredictable, and destructive to the very resources you seek to control. Economic integration is cheaper, more reliable, and creates dependencies that persist long after military occupation would have ended. When a country depends on you for critical goods, technology, or capital, it cannot oppose you without damaging itself. This is far more powerful than military dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative represents the most visible expression of this strategy. Launched in 2013, it now involves more than 150 countries and over $1 trillion in infrastructure investment. China is building ports, roads, railways, telecommunications networks, and power plants across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. These are not charity projects. They are strategic investments that create lasting dependencies. When China builds a port in Sri Lanka or Pakistan, it does not just create a commercial facility. It creates a choke point in global trade routes that China can influence. When that country cannot repay the debt, as happened with Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, China takes operational control for 99 years. This is not colonialism in the traditional sense. There are no governors or military occupations, but the effect is similar. China controls critical infrastructure, and the host country has limited sovereignty over a strategic asset. The same pattern repeats globally. China builds telecommunications infrastructure through Huawei and ZTE, embedding itself into the digital nervous systems of countries worldwide. Even if those countries later want to remove Chinese equipment due to security concerns, the cost of replacement is prohibitive and the disruption unacceptable. The dependency has been created. China does not need to threaten. The switching costs alone keep countries tied to Chinese systems. Rare earth minerals provide another example of strategic dependency creation. These elements are critical for modern technology: smartphones, electric vehicles, wind turbines, advanced weaponry. China controls over 90% of global rare earth refining capacity. Not because these minerals only exist in China, but because China systematically invested in refining capacity while Western countries allowed their own industries to atrophy. Now, any country that wants to build advanced technology must purchase rare earths from China or invest billions to recreate refining capacity that would take a decade to build. This creates leverage without confrontation. If China stopped exporting rare earths to the United States, American production of everything from F-35 fighters to electric vehicles would halt. China does not need to threaten this explicitly. The implicit understanding that it could is enough to constrain American policy options. This is strategic positioning that makes conflict unnecessary because the other side cannot afford confrontation. The semiconductor supply chain illustrates the complexity of these dependencies. Taiwan produces most of the world's advanced semiconductors through TSMC. These chips are essential for everything from smartphones to military systems. China does not currently control Taiwan, but it has created a situation where military action against Taiwan would be devastating for the global economy. not just for China. This makes American intervention to defend Taiwan economically painful, which reduces its likelihood even as the United States maintains rhetorical commitments. China's strategy toward Taiwan is patient encirclement, not invasion. Economic integration makes Taiwan increasingly dependent on mainland markets. Military exercises and diplomatic pressure gradually normalize the idea of Chinese control. At some point, likely decades from now, Taiwan may conclude that formal reunification on Beijing's terms is preferable to continued uncertainty and economic pressure. This would be portrayed as peaceful unification, not conquest, even though the result is the same. Financial infrastructure represents another layer. China built CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, as an alternative to SWIFT. Countries facing American sanctions now have an option to conduct trade outside the dollar system. Digital yuan development continues this theme. A central bank digital currency under Chinese control could eventually facilitate international trade without dollars. China is building parallel systems that allow countries to reduce dollar dependence gradually. The strategic patience this requires is remarkable. The United States thinks in four-year election cycles. China thinks in multi-decade plans. American leaders need quick results for re-election. Chinese leaders pursue strategies taking 20 or 30 years because political survival does not depend on short-term opinion. This time horizon difference is itself a strategic advantage. China's approach also exploits American overextension. The United States maintains security commitments in Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, and increasingly the Indo-Pacific more broadly. Each commitment requires resources, attention, and political capital. China can focus its resources on its immediate periphery and economic expansion, while the United States divides attention globally. When something happens in Ukraine or the Middle East, American focus shifts away from China, creating opportunities for incremental advances that go uncontested. The American response to this strategy has been reactive and inconsistent. Tariffs on Chinese goods were implemented, then partially rolled back. Restrictions on technology exports were imposed, but with exceptions that create loopholes. Rhetorical support for Taiwan continues, but without clarity on what the United States would actually do if China moved militarily. This inconsistency signals uncertainty, which encourages China to continue probing for weaknesses and expanding influence where resistance is limited. Domestically, the United States faces political polarization that makes sustained strategic focus difficult. One administration prioritizes competition with China, the next prioritizes other issues. Policy zigzags while China maintains consistent direction. Allies cannot rely on American commitments lasting beyond the next election, which makes them hedge by developing relationships with China even as they maintain American partnerships. This hedging behavior is exactly what China's strategy aims to create. The question many ask is whether China will eventually use military force to accelerate its rise. I believe this is unlikely unless China perceives that its peaceful strategy is failing or that a window of opportunity is closing. Military conflict with the United States would be catastrophic for both sides and would destroy much of what China has built. China's economy depends on access to global markets. War would cut off that access and trigger massive capital flight. The costs exceed any conceivable benefits as long as the peaceful strategy continues working. The conditions under which China might choose force are limited. If Taiwan declared formal independence rather than maintaining the current ambiguous status, Beijing might conclude that military action is necessary to prevent a permanent loss. If the United States deployed nuclear weapons to Taiwan or Japan, China might perceive an existential threat requiring response. If internal political instability in China required nationalist mobilization to maintain regime stability, military adventure could become attractive despite the costs. But absent these triggers, patience remains the rational strategy. China's approach also minimizes the risk of coalition formation against it. When you conquer through military force, you create clear enemies who unite against you. When you expand through economic integration, you create dependencies that discourage opposition. Countries that have accepted Chinese investment cannot easily join anti-China coalitions without harming their own economies. This fragments potential opposition and makes containment strategies difficult to sustain. The historical parallel that concerns me most is not Germany in the 1930s, which is the analogy many in Washington use. It is more like the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. America rose economically, built industrial capacity that exceeded European powers, developed financial systems that rivaled London, and eventually displaced Britain as the dominant global power without direct military conflict between the two. Britain declined relatively, not through defeat, but through exhaustion and the rise of a competitor with superior resources and economic dynamism. China today occupies a similar position relative to the United States that America occupied relative to Britain in 1900. It has a larger population, growing technological capacity, massive industrial output, and increasing financial sophistication. It does not need to defeat America militarily. It only needs to continue growing, while America struggles with debt, internal division, and strategic overextension. Time and compounding growth do the work that military conquest would accomplish more expensively and less reliably. For those watching this unfold, the implications are significant. Investment strategies assuming American dominance will persist are likely to underperform. Companies failing to navigate both spheres will be disadvantaged. Hedging becomes rational. Maintaining exposure to both systems provides resilience that pure loyalty to one side does not. Geographic diversification matters. Some regions will align with China, others with the United States, some will maintain independence. Southeast Asia remains contested. Africa is increasingly Chinese influenced. Latin America is uncertain. Europe tries to maintain autonomy but may lack capacity. Technology choices also carry strategic implications. Building systems on Chinese platforms creates dependencies that may become problematic if geopolitical tensions increase. Building exclusively on American platforms exposes you to similar risks if China becomes dominant in markets you care about. Maintaining optionality becomes valuable even at the cost of efficiency. The coming decades will test whether China's peaceful rise can continue or whether the Thucydides trap proves unavoidable. The Thucydides trap refers to the historical pattern where a rising power and an established power slide into war even when both would prefer peace, simply because of structural forces and mutual fear. It happened with Athens and Sparta, with Germany and Britain, and in numerous other historical cases. Can the United States and China avoid this pattern? The answer depends on factors beyond anyone's control. Miscalculation in a crisis, domestic political dynamics, nationalist mobilization, accidents that spiral out of control, all of these can trigger conflict, even when rational analysis says war serves no one's interests. But what makes the current situation different from most historical power transitions is nuclear weapons. The cost of direct great power war is now existential, which creates restraint that did not exist in previous centuries. This suggests that the competition will remain primarily economic, technological, and political rather than military, at least regarding direct conflict between the major powers. Proxy conflicts, economic warfare, cyber operations, and information campaigns will intensify. But all-out war remains unlikely unless something breaks fundamentally in the calculations that currently restrain both sides. For China, the strategic path forward is clear. Continue building dependencies, maintain economic growth, advance technologically, expand influence gradually, and wait for American overextension to create opportunities. There is no need to force the issue through confrontation. Time favors the patient player who compounds advantages systematically while the opponent exhausts itself through unfocused activity. For the United States, the response requires strategic discipline that has been absent for decades. Prioritize core interests over peripheral commitments. Rebuild industrial capacity and technological advantage. Reduce debt to restore policy flexibility. Repair domestic political dysfunction to enable consistent strategy. Form reliable alliances based on mutual interest rather than lectures about values. None of this is happening, which suggests that China's patient strategy will continue succeeding. The silent takeover is not a future possibility. It is a present reality. The question is not whether China is rising, but whether that rise will be contested effectively or simply accommodated gradually through 1,000 small adjustments that cumulatively represent a massive shift in global power. History suggests the latter is more likely because it is the path of least resistance for all actors involved. And in strategy, as in physics, objects tend to follow the path of least resistance unless significant force redirects them. China does not need war. It has a better strategy. And unless something changes fundamentally in how the United States and its allies respond, that strategy will deliver the hegemon without the cost, risk, and destruction that military conquest would require. The greatest victories are won without fighting. China understands this. The question is whether the West will recognize it before the outcome becomes irreversible.